look at two theories in contemporary political philosophy today, or this week, actually. So let's jump in there. First, I want to talk a bit about classical liberalism as opposed to classical conservatism so that you can see the difference between those two uses compared to the standard uses of conservative and liberal these days. And then we'll talk about the theory of John Rawls and then Robert Nozick. Classical liberalism. Two very important thinkers in 20th century political philosophy. The first is John Rawls, who wrote a book published in 1975 called A Theory of Justice. That book was responsible for the revival of political philosophy. Everyone had thought that all the issues in political philosophy were essentially settled by then. But in 75, this is an extremely influential book. So in that book, Rawls argues for what's called a classically liberal welfare state. A work that actually came out a little bit before, but was written in response to Rawls, or Nozick was just a little faster at getting his book out. It's called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, where he argues for a classically liberal libertarianism. I apologize if you can hear my dog barking. A lot of raucous noise out there. Okay, classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is a theory that emphasizes liberty. So classical liberals believe that there are different conceptions of the good. That is, all of these different people in a pluralistic society have different ideas about what the good life is. And classical liberals believe that government should not form a conception, or force a conception, of the good on those citizens. So that means that the people that we consider to be liberals today and the people that we consider to be conservatives in politics today are all different versions of what we call classical liberalism. Both of those are committed to liberty or freedom. Okay, now there's another view called classical conservatism. Now, the people that consider themselves to be conservatives in politics aren't what we call classical conservatives. Classical conservatism really gets its start with Edmund Burke in his reflections on the revolution in France. Now, the central doctrines of classical conservatism are three: traditionalism, a kind of political skepticism, and something called organicism. So traditionalism, the classical conservative is suspicious of large, sudden changes. That doesn't mean that political systems shouldn't change, but that change should be slow. And the thought is this: if you've got a complex system, then even small changes in a complex system can have very big, unforeseen results or consequences. And those consequences may be bad for all we know. So change should be small, and it should be done carefully. Now, the second core doctrine is skepticism, the skepticism about political knowledge. What they're skeptical of is any one person who knows the truth. Or what's the truth about what's best for society. No, what's best for society is captured in these long-standing political institutions that have a historical record of working. So notice that second phrase there: wisdom is embodied in established institutions. The third central doctrine is organicism. So it's hard to figure out what that means from the word, but what this means is that political science shouldn't be done abstractly. It's not, you can't figure out what the right thing to do when it comes to structuring society from an abstract a priori theory. What you have to do is to see what works, okay? and you can only see what works over a matter of time. John Rawls. John Rawls is definitely not a classical conservative. He's got an abstract political theory. The core concept here is what he calls justice as fairness. He's even got a book with that title. So justice for Rawls is how society's main institutions should be ordered. That includes the Constitution, that includes the legal system, that includes political structures and political institutions. It also includes the economy. The arrangement is what he calls a basic structure. That's the distribution of the primary benefits and burdens in society. Who gets what opportunities? Who gets rewarded? Who has to pay the costs? Okay. Now, the basic structure of society has profound effects on people. So it then has to be justified. So those profound effects will include things like freedom of movement. We'll come to that in a little bit. But let me go on. Okay, guiding ideas. There are really two theses. One's negative and the other is positive. The negative thesis is that people don't. There are some differences that people have that they don't really deserve. Okay, and to say that they don't deserve them means that they did nothing to earn these. So, and those are basically the differences that you have that you're born with. You may be born from a wealthy family. You may be born with certain innate talents. Okay, you may you're born in a family that comes from a certain racial background, so on, a cultural background. These things are morally arbitrary features. Okay, you didn't do anything to deserve them. The positive thesis is a thesis of what's called equality-based reciprocity. What that means for Rawls is that the goods of society, whether that's wealth or power or so on, should be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution is to everyone's advantage. Okay, goods should be distributed equally unless it's to everyone's advantage to make an unequal distribution. Okay, here are the primary goods that I started to mention earlier. These primary goods are basic rights and liberties. That includes the freedom of movement, a free choice among what kind of job you might do. It includes powers and benefits that are attached to certain offices and positions of responsibility. Those primary goods also include income and wealth, and something that he calls the social bases of self-respect. That's the recognition by social institutions that give a citizen a sense of self-worth and the confidence to carry out one's plans. So the social bases of self-respect. That might include giving you the right to vote, right? And since you have the right to vote, we believe that bestows a sense of dignity on the person, but also a sense of respect for that person's opinion. So that would be included in the social basis of self-respect. Okay, how do you divide up these primary goods? Well, Rawls has an idea. And what he's going to use is a hypothetical choice situation that will motivate his position. His position being that these things should be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution is to everyone's advantage. So now this hypothetical situation does not establish his reasoning as good. So that's important to keep in mind. He's going to need an argument for that. Okay, well, here's the hypothetical situation. It all starts with a piece of cake. Now, what's the most fair way to divide a piece of cake? And the answer is, so before I give you the answer, let's go back and we'll motivate the problem. But let's say that you have two 8-year-old nephews and they're staying with you for a bit. So you've got one piece of cake and you're going to split it between these two kids. How do you split the cake so that each one of them is satisfied with the size of the piece that they got? Or better yet, if they're unsatisfied, they have no one to blame but themselves. Okay, so let's say you have this cake up here. I'll draw the picture. Let's go with this size. Okay, here's our piece of cake. How are we going to split it? Well, notice if you cut the cake, there's no way that you're going to be able to cut this cake exactly evenly. So the kid that gets the smallest piece is going to blame you. Okay, so how do you settle this issue? Well, the classic solution is this: that one cuts and the other chooses. So let's go back to our piece of cake. Let me make it the line a bit smaller. We've got this. Now, if the first kid decides to cut it like this, right, and then he's going to think, well, I know since I'm the one cuts and the other chooses, if I cut it like that, I'm going to get this piece, right? So the cutter is guaranteed to get the smallest piece. So to do that, what that person will do is try to maximize the minimum size piece. Make the smallest piece as big as it can possibly be. Okay, so that means we're almost nearly guaranteed to get a perfect egalitarian distribution. Okay, one cuts, the other chooses. Results in equal slices. Now, we've got two assumptions that are being made here. Well, one is that equality is good. Okay, well, there may be some situations where this breaks down. Let's say I'm the cutter and I just really don't like chocolate cake, and I'm going to eat some to look nice here, not to offend my host, but I don't want very much, so I'm going to cut off a small piece and let the other person have the bigger piece. So assuming here that equality is good, or maybe I'm a diabetic and I don't need to be eating that big a piece of cake anyway, something like that. Okay, Rawls is assuming that equality is good. The other assumption, this is not an implausible assumption, is that people are selfish. They want the most for themselves. Okay, those two are assumptions being made. They may or may not be correct, okay, but they're not implausible. Okay, now Rawls has this distributive outcome in mind, which is something that's relatively equal. The example is supposed to lead you to it, but he needs more than just this example. He needs an argument that it's a good thing. Okay, so now let's get to the meat of the position. The original position. Rawls is a social contract theorist. Okay, unlike Hobbes and Locke, he doesn't think there actually is a social contract. It's just a hypothetical tool to let us understand what the best kind of society would be. So the original position is the same as his version of the state of nature. So imagine that you had to design a social order. That means that you have to come up with the economic system, you have to come up with the political system, everything about that social order. But you had no information about your particular situation in that order. You only know certain general facts. Let's imagine that you had to design that, but what then would you pick? Okay, so here's a key idea in this hypothetical tool called the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is what separates you. Let's say here's the original position here. Okay, this is the veil of ignorance, and this is civil society over here. This is over on this side. It's where we have the political system. We've got an economic system. We've got offices that have positions of power and responsibility. All that stuff is chosen by the original contract in the original position. Okay, but this wall here, called the veil of ignorance, it's really an epistemic veil. It prevents us from knowing over here what our situation will be like over there. Okay, so over here in the original position, individuals don't know facts about those morally arbitrary features. They don't know what race they'll be a member of. They don't know what their gender will be. They don't know what their income will be. They don't know what will they be born to a wealthy family or a poor family. So they don't know any of that stuff. What they do know in the original position is that whatever society will be like, it's going to be a pluralistic society where people will have different conceptions about what a good life is for them. So you may have, you may know in the original position that once we cross that veil of ignorance, we're going to find that people have different religious views, different sort of political views, okay, different conceptions about what's valuable, what's not. The other thing that we know is that it's going to be a situation of moderate scarcity. So this is important. Remember when we talked about Marx. Marx thought in order for communism to succeed, capitalism first had to build a situation of superabundance. Okay, compare that with Hobbes. Hobbes, we don't have moderate scarcity. We've got sort of a radical scarcity. Now, we've got two different views there. Under Hobbes, because there's a situation of radical scarcity, we're all competing for goods that we need to survive. So that results in that state of war. Under communism, since there is a superabundance, Marx thought, that means that we don't have to compete for anything, right? We don't have to worry about how to divide resources because everybody's going to have absolutely everything that they need or want. Okay, Rawls is in the middle here. Rawls says, no, we don't find ourselves in a position of radical scarcity, we're trying to kill each other, but also there will never be superabundance. We'll always have to make some decisions about how to distribute resources. Okay, there may be everything that everyone needs basically to live, but that doesn't mean that everybody's going to have everything that they want. So we are going to have to always make these difficult decisions about how we should distribute resources. Okay, now in that position of not knowing, again, what race, gender, even sexual preference, Rawls thinks, let's imagine that you can't know any of that stuff. Then you had to choose some basic rules to set up society. Here are the three basic rules he thinks you'd pick. First is called the greatest equal liberty. Okay. Then 2 and 3 here are really two different parts of the same rule. So number 2 is the fair equality of opportunity, and number 3 is the difference principle. So we'll jump into that. Okay, the first principle says each person has the same indefeasible. Okay, indefeasible means it's without exceptions, in a sense. Indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which scheme is compatible with the same scheme of liberties for all. Greatest equal liberty. So we should give every individual in society the most liberty that a person can get, such that it doesn't interfere with other people having the same amount of liberty. So, for example, that's going to rule out certain things. You're not going to have the liberty to be a slaveholder, okay, because that liberty is only possible if there's somebody else who doesn't have the same amount of liberty that you do. So liberty up to a certain point, past that point, it's going to have too many conflicts, right? So what we want to do is to maximize liberty up to the point that giving somebody any more liberty is not going to be compatible with giving other people the same amount. Okay, the second principle. Two parts to the second principle. And the reason they're grouped together is that they're both about inequalities. Social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. The first is called the fair equality of opportunity. They're to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So there are fair reasons for preventing someone from holding a certain position or having a job, but there are non-fair reasons also. Uh, so a fair reason is that you just don't have the skills to do the job. So, for example, if let's say I want to be an NBA center, okay. Well, there's a problem with that. One is I'm 57 years old. I have a 6-inch vertical leap, and there's no way that I could do that position. I can perform that role. Okay, so that means I can legitimately be restricted from doing that for fair reasons. Okay, but let's say you're good at math, you know Excel very well, you've passed the CPA exam. We can't keep you from being an accountant just because you're, let's say, a woman or I don't like you, whatever, right? So it's got to be fair equality of opportunity. The second is the controversial one. Actually, the principle one, which is greatest equal liberty. Principle two, fair equality of opportunity. Those are not controversial, right? So I think everyone is going to think those are good principles. Number two says social and economic inequalities must satisfy what's called the difference principle. They are to be the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. So Rawls thinks that we would, from the original position, choose to have an economic or social inequality only if it would be a benefit to the worst off in society. So we'll look at this for a minute and see how this works. Notice, I want you to notice that this is not out of, from a Rawlsian position, this is not out of concern with the disadvantaged. You don't pick this because you care about necessarily care about the people at the bottom. You care about this in the original position because that might be you at the bottom for all you know. Okay, so why would we choose these principles? We choose them by comparing a society with those principles with the alternatives from behind that veil of ignorance in the original position. Here's a key idea. Would it ever be rational for you to choose a system in which some people are better off than you? Okay. Would it ever be rational? Rational here in this sense means, would it be in your interest to choose a system which some people are better off than you? And the answer is yes, absolutely. If in that system you were better off than you would have been in an alternative system. Okay, so it makes sense for you to choose a system in which some people are better off than you if that makes you better off also. Okay, so let's look at a graph here to see this, what's going on. So let's imagine that we've got two distributions, D1 on the left, D2 on the right. And D1 is an egalitarian distribution. So look, in D1 we've got 50 total units of some good, and both groups get 25. Okay, it's just split right down the middle. So it's an egalitarian distribution. Now, notice behind the original position, you don't know which group you're going to be in. Are you going to be in the blue group or are you going to be in the green group? So you've got to choose either D1 or D2 without knowing which group you're going to be in. Rawls thinks, and this is pretty reasonable, that you would be, from the original position, you should choose D2. Why is that? Because in D2, you are better off than you would have been in D1 no matter which group you're in. Okay? Even if you're in the green group, which is the worst off group in D2, you ought to choose D2 because you're better off in D2 in the green group than you are in D1. So basically, when it comes to choosing an economic and social system, what you ought to do from the original position is to look at the worst off group, okay, in both or however many alternatives you have to pick from. You ought to pick the system that makes the worst off group the best off that they would be, okay? So I don't need to look at that blue group. All I need to do is look at each system and say, okay, who's the worst off group in this system, and pick the one that has the best worst off group, if that makes any sense. And in this case, that's D2. Okay, it's true in D2 that if I'm in the green group, there's some people who are better off than I am. Okay, but the only reason that I wouldn't pick D2 is because I just don't want somebody to be better off than I am. But that's really just kind of irrational reason, right? Why would I opt for D1 when D1 is going to result in basically a 1/3 reduction of my good? Okay, that would just be stupid. So look at all the alternatives and pick the one that has the best off, worst off group. So we can see how this works with religious liberty. Okay, so should we pick a state that has religious liberty, or should we pick a state that has an established church? Well, justice for Rawls is from the standpoint of the worst off. Okay, so the most adversely affected person, the worst off. If the most disadvantaged in a society would choose that, then of course everybody would choose that, he thinks. If the people who are worst off in society would have chosen that society, then the other people don't have anything to complain about. So notice this kind of reasoning is purely self-interested. I don't care what's better for other people. I'm only interested in what's best for myself. Okay. So what we have to do is ask, who's the worst off in both of these scenarios? One, where people have religious liberty, or two, where people have established church. No matter what system we pick, there are going to be people who don't get what they want. Okay. So with the case of religious liberty, who's disadvantaged? The people who wanted an established church. Okay, but they're disadvantaged in that society, but they still get to worship the way that they want. Okay, so let's look at the people who are disadvantaged in the established church. Well, they are forced to follow the religion that they don't want to follow. They don't get to follow the religion that they want. So we've got two situations. We've got two disadvantaged groups. One group's disadvantage is that they get to worship that way that they want, but they want everybody to worship that way. Okay. In the other scenario, we've got people who are forced to worship in a way that they don't want to. Okay. So in the case of religious liberty, we've got more freedom. That group, the worst off group, is less disadvantaged than the worst off group in the case where we have a state church. So keep in mind here that the First Amendment's not neutral between all positions. It's not neutrality. What it is the greatest amount of liberty for everybody. That's compatible with that same amount of liberty for everyone else. Okay. Moving on. Some objections. Well, we've already heard an objection last time when we talked, not last time, but the time before. We talked about social contract theory. Ronald Dworkin makes this objection that a hypothetical contract can't ground moral obligation. I don't know that Rawls' purpose here is the same as like Hobbes and Locke. He's not trying to argue that you've got an obligation to obey the laws of the government here, What he's trying to show is use this as a hypothetical tool that helps us understand which social and political system it would be best. Okay, it's not that you're making this contract gives you certain obligations. It's that thinking of this as a situation that people would choose from this situation, from the original position. It is a way of thinking of it. If it's a system that everybody would choose, then surely it's the best system. Okay, so that's the thinking there. Another objection is, and this is focused more on what Rawls does here, is that, well, why think that from the original position everyone would actually choose the difference principle? The problem here is that the difference principle is a really risk-averse way of thinking. Here's a person who's not willing to take any gamble at all. What they're trying to do is, let's just play it safe and make my worst outcome the best it could possibly be. That's this what's called maximin reasoning. I want to maximize the minimum. Let's make the worst off I could be the best off. Okay, so I'm not willing to take a big risk to gamble on getting something that's really good. All I want to do is minimize the bad outcomes. Well, I think if I were Rawls, here's how I'd respond. Sometimes it makes sense to make a gamble, to take a risk. But in order for risky behavior to be sensible, you've got to know what the probability of the bad outcome is going to be. And you've got to know something about the values of the rewards plus the costs. The problem here is we don't really know what the risk is, because from the original position, we're cut off from any knowledge about how many people are going to be in the best off group as opposed to the worst off group. It could be that what I think is not a very risky decision is going to be extremely risky, because it could be that there's only one person that's well off and everybody else is bad off in society. So I really don't know how to rationally gamble, given that I don't know the costs and I don't know what the probabilities are. So what I ought to do is really play it safe in situations like that. So Rawls can have some objections. Now, I didn't put my major objection to this, but my major objection is that, and this is the case with all of social contract theory, I think, is that we have to make decisions about what's good from a real abstract position. I've got to pretend that I don't know anything about what's good and then choose what's good. I've got to pretend that my only conception of good is self-interest, but that's not the case. We're born into communities that already have a conception of the good, and we can't just throw that away, then choose it from some abstract level. So I think that's the most serious objection here. Let's move on to Nozick. Nozick is probably the most famous libertarian in political thought, at least in the 20th century. So the libertarian believes that at least Nozick's kind of libertarian, that using someone, and that can mean using someone's wealth, right? Using the things that someone has earned, using that person for the common good is a violation of the rights of that person. Okay, so people should be given maximal liberty and should, in as far as possible, never be coerced to act for someone else's good. Okay, this is going to sound a lot like what we talked about when we talked about Mill's on liberty. Okay, now, Nozick is also a kind of social contract theorist. So Nozick says, again, purely hypothetical, let's imagine that there's no government. Okay, what would that be like? Well, one thing it would be like is that I would have to guard all of my own property. I'm responsible for protecting my own property. If there's a fire, I've got to put it out, right? If there are burglars, I've got to protect my stuff against them. So notice if I have to do that, I'm going to have to watch my property at all times. So if I have to watch my property at all times to make sure it doesn't catch fire or to make sure that nobody's stealing it, I can't do that and also do my job. So what we would do in that situation is to form what Nozick calls a protective association. So I'm going to band together with you and we're going to agree to watch each other's stuff. So I go do my job for 8 hours, and while I'm doing that, you watch my stuff. And then you go to work to earn your income, and while you're doing that, I'm watching your stuff. So that's good, but it's really inefficient. So the best thing to do, Nozick thinks, he thinks this is going to be the next step in that situation, is that somebody forms like a protection company, and they do this professionally. And then all we do is kind of subscribe to those services, okay? So we're paying someone else for protection. Well, at that point, then what would happen? Well, what would happen, Nozick thinks, is that this would end up with just one company that essentially provides that protection, because they are going to have coercive power. So coercive power, remember, means that's the power to make another person do what they don't want to do. A protection company is going to have coercive power, not de jure power necessarily, but de facto power. And the reason they'll have to have it is because they're going to have to keep the burglar from stealing the stuff. The burglar wants to steal your stuff, and the protective association is going to keep them from doing what they want. They coerce them from doing what they want. But in order to do that, there can only be one protective association. Okay? These protective associations can't be in competition with each other. Because each protective association is going to have to keep the other protective association from doing something. And there's going to be one that's got to be the strongest, and eventually that one gets a monopoly. For coercive power to be a good thing, for it to be successful, it has to be a monopoly. So that protective association is going to have to buy up all the others or just defeat them in some big battle and wipe them out. Okay, so that protective association becomes a monopoly and essentially just becomes the state. Now, notice though, the state at this point only really has one power, and that's to protect the property and rights of other people. Okay, what happens when somebody doesn't want to participate in this protective association in the state? Well, a successful social contract depends on consent, and there always will be people who don't want to consent. Some people just don't want to be a part of the state at all. Well, you can't have people who just opt out, because we have to set up certain rules, and everyone's going to have to follow those rules whether they want to or not. Okay, these are rules that are just maybe they're just coordination rules for the good of society, like what side of the street are we all going to drive on. Here's a case where we don't want every individual making that decision for him or herself. Why? Because that leads to chaos. So there are going to have to be rules, and everybody's going to be forced to follow those rules. Since they don't consent, they're going to lose something. They don't get what they want. To be fair, we're going to have to compensate them for the loss. Now, is this possible? Actually, no, because if you compensate someone, let's say we've got a dissenter, to bring them into the association. We're going to say, all right, we know you didn't want to be a part of it, so we're going to pay you $10,000 to be part of our association, because we have to have everybody in it. We're going to compensate you for the loss. So what's going to happen if other people hear about this? Well, everyone else is going to be a dissenter too, because being a dissenter, you're much better off being a dissenter and coming into the group having been paid $10,000 than coming into the group voluntarily without any reward. So actually, it's not possible to compensate people for their loss. Now, if you're an anarchist, you believe that since unanimous consent is impossible, no state ever is justified. Uh, that's an interesting position. Libertarians are closer to anarchists than they would be to Rawls, for instance. But strictly speaking, I think there are a lot of problems with strict anarchism. For one sense, we need rules just to coordinate our actions, like the driving case. Okay, social contract. Here's Nozick's version of the social contract. The only state that everyone would agree to is a minimal state. So a state that protects property that's a state where you could get probably the closest to everyone agreeing to form that state. A state like Rawls, no, there are going to be a lot of people who didn't want to agree to that, but everyone would agree to a state that provides, let's say, fire and police services and defense. Okay, so the only state that everyone would agree to is a minimal state, therefore the minimal state is the only state that's justified. Okay, now keep in mind, still, not everybody would agree. That's going to be a problem. Okay, here are the rules of justice for Nozick. There are 3 sets of rules, and this is it. These sets of rules govern 3 things. 1, how things that are not already owned can be acquired. How do people get property when nobody owns that property before? This is about initial acquisition. Okay, 2, how the property can be transferred from one person to another. So we've got rules of acquisition, and now we've got rules of transfer. Then the 3rd set of rules are the rules of rectification. How do we rectify unjust acquisitions and unjust transfers? Unjust acquisitions, unjust transfers. Okay, now here's Rawls, or not Rawls, but Nozick's key idea. A distribution is just if that distribution came about from following those 3 sets of rules. Okay, a distribution is just if it comes about by following those 3 sets of rules. So if a distribution is a result of just initial acquisitions, just transfers, and of course you don't need a rectification if every acquisition and every transfer was just. So if it's made up completely of just initial acquisitions and just transfers, then it's going to be a just distribution, no matter what it looks like, okay? No matter what it looks like. Okay, his rules of acquisition, basically lock-in. So since a person owns what he makes, a person can appropriate property that's not owned, provided that you leave enough and it's good for others. So Nozick says that's violated when a person appropriates everything that's necessary for life. So you can't take the only water source. You can't take all the productive food sources, things like that. But as long as you give people access to water and stuff like that, it's fine. Okay, we've got 2 distinctions: historical versus in-state, and pattern versus unpatterned. So in-state theories say that just distributions are defined in terms of some arithmetical feature of distribution. And in-state theory says that if we've got a just distribution, what makes it just is essentially we've already agreed upon what a just distribution would look like, and doesn't look like that. Okay. Historical theories say, no, it's not how it looks like in the end. It's what was the process that led up to that final outcome. If it was a just historical process, then it's going to be just. Okay, so that's key distinction. Let's look at an example here. Let's say that we've got 3 different distributions, D1, D2, D3. We've got 3 different people in this little micro society. Okay, under D1, person A has 12 units, person B has 10, person C has 9. Under D2, person A has 4, person B has 26, and person C has 13. D3, we've got 20, 10, and 10. Okay, now think about how egalitarians utilitarian and how Rawls would evaluate these. So what would an egalitarian look for? An egalitarian would look for a situation where everybody is as close to being equal as possible. And they would look at the difference between the person who has the most and the person who has the least. Okay, so under D1, that's 3 units between A and C, right? On D2, that is 22 units between A and B. And then on D3, it's 10 units between A and B and C, both. Okay, so egalitarians there are going to prefer D1. It's the closest to being equal. Well, what about a utilitarian? A utilitarian is going to look at what's the greatest amount of utility in each distribution. So utilitarian is going to sum them all up, it looks like. So we've got 12 plus 9 is 21, 31 for D1. We've got 40 in D3, and we've got 39 plus 4 is 43 in D2. So it looks like a utilitarian is going to prefer D2. We've got the greatest balance of happiness. We've got the highest level of welfare in D2. Okay. Rawls is going to say, okay, who's the worst off group in all of these? And let's pick the one where the worst off is the best off. So that worst off group in D1 is C. The worst off in D2 is A. The worst off in D3 is, well, actually both B and C are tied. So we've got 9 versus 4 versus 10. We pick the one with 10, and that's D3. So Rawls wants D3. Okay, so those are all examples of an in-state theory. Now, notice that in-state theory, we don't have to know how these differences came about. For an in-state theory, all we have to do is take a snapshot right now, and we can tell by some consideration. It's going to differ if you're an egalitarian, utilitarian, or Rawlsian. But we can tell which one is a just outcome, which one's an unjust outcome, right? Because you've already decided here's what that final just outcome has to look like. Okay, what about Nozick? What would Nozick say about this stuff? He's going to say, well, is he going to agree with the egalitarian, the utilitarian, or Rawls? Actually, Nozick is just going to say, I don't know. Okay. Why is that? Because I can't tell from looking at the final state if all the initial acquisitions were just and all the transfers were just. Okay. So it doesn't matter what it looks like in the end. What matters is how it got there for Nozick. Okay, another distinction is patterned versus unpatterned. So patterned theories say that just distributions match the distribution of some other pattern. For instance, a pattern theory would be one where what determines a just distribution is just the level of economic effort. So do the people who work the hardest get the most return? Or maybe it could be match the level of virtue in society. The virtuous people should get the most, vicious people should get the least. Okay. All right, Nozick says that's bad too. Why? Because it always requires interfering with liberty. He's got a quote from Anarchy, State, and Utopia that says, "Liberty upsets patterns." Okay, because if I've got a patterned theory, that means I've got to ensure that the distribution of wealth matches the distribution of virtue or the distribution of economic effort. So the person who works the hardest always has the most. But what that does is interfere with that person's ability to do what he or she wants with his or her money. Okay, so imagine that Jane is the person who works the hardest. On this pattern theory, she should be the one who always has the most. But what if Jane works the hardest but doesn't really like wealth and wants to give it all away? Is that Jane's prerogative? Well, Nozick thinks yes. Again, he's a libertarian. We should maximize liberty. People should have the freedom to do what they want with their finances. Redistribution is always unjust if those principles of justice were followed. Okay, so for Nozick, if initial acquisition was just and the transfer was just, then it's absolutely and always wrong to take away from people who have something and give it to people who do not. He's got an example in the book about Wilt Chamberlain, famous basketball player back in the 60s, 70s, I think. I don't know anything about sports, so I think that's the right decades. So Nozick imagines that he's really famous basketball player, really popular basketball player. He's so popular that people are willing to come see him and pay extra for seeing him just because he's Wilt Chamberlain. So what he does, and the team agree to, that Wilt can put out let's say a bucket in which people pay that extra money just to see him, and all that money goes to him, right? It's good for the team, it's good for the owner, just to be able to have Wilt Chamberlain on their team. So in the end, he says, imagine that this goes on for a long time, and suddenly Wilt has all of this money. Now, let's say you're an egalitarian. You say, no, everybody should have an equal distribution. So we should take that stuff away from Wilt and give it back to the people who gave it. But Nozick says that would be wrong. Why is that? Because they gave that money to Wilt because they wanted to. Okay? So it would be wrong to give it back to them because that would be interfering with their ability to do what they wanted with their money. Okay, this is going to be a theory that has a lot of attraction to a lot of people, but it's got some problems. It's got one that's a small problem, that first one. I'm not sure what to do with it, but it's got a major problem, which is the second. Okay, so one problem for Nozick is this notion of, he's committed in the beginning to that what justifies a state is mutual consent. Okay, the only reason that minimal state is justified is because that's the one that everybody would consent to. But at the same time, he recognizes that there's always going to be dissenters, and he says we're going to have to compel these people to be part of the state. Well, that seems to be an inconsistency, right? The only state that's justified is the one that's grounded in mutual consent of everyone, but there's no state like that, so you're going to have to compel people. Well, if I'm going to have to compel people anyway, then why then is the minimal state the only state that's justified? Okay, so that's an issue that he needs to deal with. Second problem, and this is a big problem. Let's say that you agree with everything that Rawls has said as far as the basic components of his theory. And that is only a historical, unpatterned distribution is just. And the historical part is only the distribution that comes about because of completely just initial acquisitions and just transfers would be justified. Okay, so, and if you do have an end result that's not the result of just initial acquisition and subsequent just transfers, then it's required that you rectify those injustices. All right, so what we have to ask then is our distribution of wealth a result of just initial acquisition and just transfers? And the answer to that has to be no. Okay, we've got two major groups that were whose rights were violated when it comes to the distribution of wealth. That would be Native Americans and descendants, African slaves and their descendants. Okay, Just think about the history of Oklahoma. So there were unjust initial acquisitions and there were unjust transfers. So Nozick's theory requires that there be a redistribution that rectifies those violations. How do we do that? Nozick, at this point in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, just throws up his hands and says, I don't know how it's possible. Okay, so even if you think that Nozick's theoretical framework is right, there's this huge practical problem, okay, that's going to require significant redistribution. All right, that's it for Rawls and Nozick. If there are any questions, make sure that you ask me in class next week. So I hope everybody has a good week off from Intro to Philosophy, and I'll see you next week.